All right, so we're back with part two of our chapter one lecture, and we're moving on now to growth. Now, growth is one of those things you have to be careful about because if it's a really, really small organism, you're not going to see it grow very much to begin with, right? If it's a single-celled organism, it's going to be really hard to tell if it's actually grown. It might increase in size by a little bit, but then again, if you're talking about only a few fractions of a millimeter across, you might not notice it, right? But all living things, in some way, shape, or form, do get bigger over time. And there's really only a couple of ways to do this. If you are what we call a multicellular organism, and multicellular is an important term, and it means a little bit more than what you think on the surface. Multicellular means it's not only made up of more than one cell, which is true, made up of more than one cell, but those cells also have to specialize. Those cells have to be divided up into what we call tissues if they're going to be truly a multicellular organism. All right, so if you are a multicellular organism, the way that you grow is by adding more cells to your body. And that seems pretty straightforward. I mean, every single one of us started off as a single-celled zygote, a fertilized egg, a single cell. And at this point in time, an average human being is something in the order of like 100 trillion cells in size. Clearly, we're way bigger now than we were the moment we were conceived. The way that we did that was by adding more cells to our bodies. We went from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 and so on until eventually now we're at roughly 100 trillion or so cells. All right, so that works if you're multicellular, but what about if you're a bacteria? What about if you're a single-celled organism? Well, since they're only made of more than one cell, they don't really have the option of just adding more cells to their bodies. What they have to do is by making their individual cells get bigger. And so that's how they're going to grow, is they take that one cell they have and they make it get larger physically over time, almost like blowing up a balloon. Now, the growth criteria is really, really closely tied to that criteria we talked about a second ago with metabolism, the previous lecture with metabolism. Because if you don't have some energy, if you don't have some nutrients, if you don't have the building blocks, then you can't make yourself bigger. You don't just spontaneously get bigger without eating anything. Right? You have to add materials to your body if you're going to get bigger. So that's kind of related to metabolism that way. All right, the next one has to do with variability and adaptability and natural selection. All right, so evolution. Evolution is defined as a change in a population's gene frequency over time. The proportions of genes or alleles in the population, if they change over time, that population has evolved. Right? So for this to work, there have to be a couple of things in place. Number one, the organisms have to be variable. They have to be different from each other. If every single organism looks or acts or behaves or resembles every other organism, then evolution doesn't really work very well. There has to be variability. And if there's variability, now there's potential for something we call natural selection. Right? Natural selection is where you take some type of trait or traits, you add some sort of selective pressure to it. In this case, our selective pressure is antibiotics that people use. We have a population of Staphylococcus aureus bacteria in this picture here. Staphylococcus aureus normally is fairly susceptible to antibiotics. In other words, antibiotics work pretty well on it. But occasionally there could be this one bad egg down here, this one down here that has a mutation. And this random chance, dumb luck mutation that this bacteria wasn't trying to do happens to make that one bacteria resistant to antibiotics. So this population right now hasn't really evolved that much. I mean, yeah, the gene frequencies are slightly different than what they were before, but it's not a huge change. After we add in a selective pressure, after we add in the antibiotics, though, all of a sudden now we have the environment selecting this individual to go ahead and reproduce more than the rest. Because this one's resistant, the others are susceptible, the red one gets to reproduce more, and several generations later, now we have a population that's vastly different than the population was before the antibiotic was present. And so that's evolution. All right, the next one's reproduction. And we're going to talk about a chapter on reproduction later on in the course. Really two main types. We've got asexual versus sexual reproduction. We can look at both types of reproduction. But in both cases, they're just an organism making more of itself. The strategy they use can differ. It does differ a lot between them. But that's kind of the overall picture of what's going on here. Again, the DNA has to be passed along faithfully, accurately, consistently to the next generation. You do not want there to be a huge range of variability in the offspring. Some is okay, too much usually is not a good thing. Now, when you start looking at organisms that reproduce sexually, organisms that do meiosis followed by fertilization, there does tend to be more diversity. for organisms that reproduce sexually than those that do asexually because of some certain kinds of things that go on during meiosis that allow sperm cells and egg cells to be very different from each other, thereby creating some diversity in the offspring that are eventually produced. But you do not want there to be this unchecked mass variability that might occur as a result of, say, rampant mutation. That generally is not going to be a recipe for success for any organism. All right, all living things are organic. And organic in this context doesn't mean grown on a farm without pesticides where people sing to the plants and it's a very nice picture of what you should buy and pay a lot of money for because it's organic. Organic in this context means carbon-based. Specifically, there are 4 kinds of organic molecules that we find in all living organisms. You've got carbohydrates, which you've already mentioned. Some carbohydrates tend to be more of the energy, the fuel in the short to medium term for an organism. We've got proteins, which have a huge range of functions in organisms. There's a half dozen things that proteins do for us. We've got lipids, or fats, and even lipids and fats can have maybe 3 or 4 different types of functions for living organisms, generally. And we also have DNA and RNA. DNA, RNA, those are also organic molecules. We talked about them up here with heredity. All living things are made up of nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA, lipids, proteins, and sugars, or carbohydrates. Living things are made up of, at a minimum, those 4 molecules. And then finally, for our characteristics of life, living things tend to have sensitivity to environmental stimuli. What that means is that there is some type of external or internal event, perturbation if you want to use a fancy word, the organism can respond to that. If there's a flash of light, if somebody throws something at your head, you're going to blink. You're going to respond to the stimulus to protect yourself, right? So we have the ability to do that both on the outside, but also internally as well. If you look at an organism like an animal, all different types of stimulus sensing type machinery. We've got eyes and ears and chemoreceptors in the nose and the mouth, electroreceptors, other kinds of chemoreceptors, magnetic receptors in some organisms, pain receptors, heat receptors, cold receptors, all kinds of things to help receive environmental stimuli in the body. On the inside of the body, there can be other kinds of things. There can be stretch receptors. There can be pain receptors on the inside as well. There can be temperature receptors, chemoreceptors inside the body to make sure your blood pH is within a range of what's not going to kill you. All different types of ways to monitor what's going on not only outside the body, but also inside the body. I think we tend to focus more on what's on the outside than on the inside, but that's not all there is to the story. There's also internal receptors in place as well. It's not just animals. All right, other organisms, plants, bacteria, fungi, algae, all of those organisms also respond to stimuli. Even though we don't notice it outwardly in them, they're doing it. You can do all kinds of lab experiments where you take plants and mess with them to affect where light's coming from, where nutrients come from, where water comes from, where gravity is for them. They respond to it. Same with bacteria. They respond to stimuli as well. All living things do this. Whether or not humans can see it or perceive it is another matter. All the organisms respond to stimuli. All right, the next section we're going to look at is the so-called tree of life and the 3 main branches that make up the categorization of all living organisms on the planet. Kind of some of the things we look at when we're trying to classify organisms. And people really like to classify things. We like to categorize, we like to organize, we like to keep things nice and neat categories as much as possible. The first set we're going to look at are really broad ones. These are the kinds of things you would use to tell a bacteria apart from a plant, apart from an animal, right? So really broad kinds of things. Number 1, how many cells do they have? I told you it was broad, right? Are they single cell or are they multicellular? Remember we said multicellular is not only having more than one cell, but those cells also have to specialize. If you have a Petri plate with 100 gazillion bacteria growing on it, it's not a multicellular organism because those bacteria are not cooperating. They're together. There's definitely more than one cell, but they're not specializing. They're not dividing the labor. They're not forming tissues or anything like that. So single-celled versus multicellular. We can look at how they get their energy. Are they autotrophic? Are they heterotrophic? Do we know what the difference is? All right, you want to go back and think about the differences between autotroph and heterotroph. We can look at whether or not they have a nucleus. 2 really big categories of living things, prokaryotic versus eukaryotic. The name prokaryotic literally means before there was a nucleus. Pre-nucleus organisms like bacteria are prokaryotic. Eukaryotic organisms are those things that have a nucleus, a true nucleus. So things like animals and plants and fungi and protists are eukaryotes, whereas bacteria and archaeobacteria are prokaryotes. All right, so we can look at those categories. We can also tend to look at sort of the organization within an organism. Right? We can look at the cell level, into the tissue level, into the organ level, and so forth. And we're going to kind of go there next. But it's important to remember, too, that we're still part of the physical universe. Even though the living things are special in a sense, that sounds kind of warm and fuzzy, but we do have our own characteristics. We still have to play by the same rules as chemistry and physics. Because biology is based on chemistry is based on physics. We have to kind of go by the same rules they go by. Perfect example would be the laws of thermodynamics we talked about before. Right? You got to play by those rules. It doesn't work as a living thing to say that, oh, you know what, I'm immune from the laws of thermodynamics. Doesn't apply to me because I'm alive. It doesn't work that way. Okay? So we're going to talk about something called emergent properties. And this is one of those concepts that's often really hard for people to grasp the first time they see it. The idea of an emergent property is that as you get more complex, as the complexity of a system increases, that system takes on new characteristics. And those new characteristics are called emergent properties. If something emerges, it's coming out of something else, right? So as you increase in complexity, new traits emerge. And properties are pretty straightforward. These are new traits that come out as complexity increases for an organism. So emergent properties. And we'll talk about a few examples of those as we go up through the hierarchy of levels of organization in the body. All right. So back to the categorization of life just for a second here. We talked about prokaryotic and eukaryotic. All right, we'll see domains here in a second. The bacteria, the archaeobacteria, they're always unicellular, whereas eukaryotes are, for the most part, multicellular. There are lots of examples there as well, but for the most part, eukaryotes tend to be more on the side of multicellular. All right. And of course, we also talked about how they get their energy. This slide's kind of reiterating what we saw a couple of slides ago. So domains. When we look at classification of life on the planet, you could take any organism, right, and classify it. You start with the highest, most broad level, the most general level, the domain level. You go domain. The next most specific level is the kingdom. And then you go to phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay, so it's kind of a mouthful there, but we go domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And you can do that for any organism. Okay, so the domain level is the broadest level. We have domain bacteria. There's a second domain called the archaea, which are a different type of prokaryote, completely, very, very different from the bacteria. And then the third domain is the eukarya. And so within the eukarya, now we have four kingdoms. We have the kingdom Protista, we have the kingdom Fungi, the kingdom Plantae, and the kingdom Animalia. And then within each one of those kingdoms, there are classes and orders and family and genera and species. So for example, we could take humans. Humans are in the domain Eukarya. We are in the kingdom Animalia. We are in the phylum Chordata, which will mean more to us once we get into the animal chapters here in a few days. We are in the class Mammalia, because we're mammals. We are in the order Primates, with other types of monkey-like species. We are in the order Primates. We are in the family Hominidae, which is the human family, which includes humans and all of our ancestors, which are now extinct. And we're in the genus Homo, species Sapiens. So that's classification for humans, but you could do that for any other species. You could do that for raccoons. You could do that for, this is a sweet gum tree up here in this picture. You could do that for fungi. You could do it for any organism classification. Right? So these are our really broad level, domain level classification schemes. Bacteria, archaea, eukarya, and then again within the eukarya we have these four kingdoms. Sorry. That's kind of the tree of life, so to speak. This is, some old, really, really long time ago kind of common ancestor. There was a split that occurred for the bacteria, which bacteria were then allowed to diversify beyond that. And then time goes on, you see another split with the archaea and another split eventually with the eukarya. All right, so unicellular organisms. Bacteria, always unicellular. Archaea, always unicellular. Protists, sometimes unicellular. If you look at something like an amoeba, these guys over here are supposed to be amoebas in this picture. Right? Amoebas, paramecium, Those kinds of organisms are single-celled, but they are eukaryotic. Multicellularity, on the other hand, occurs in the fungi. It occurs in the plants always. Plants are always multicellular. And animals are always multicellular. Protists, again, can be in this category as well. The protists are a really diverse kingdom. They could be unicellular or multicellular, depending on which group of protists you're looking at. They could be prokaryotic or eukaryotic, depending on which group of protists you're looking at as well. They're a very, very diverse type of kingdom. All right, so now we're going to look at classification, the hierarchy within a single organism. The smallest unit of what we're going to look at in our hierarchy are molecules. You could go back to the atomic level. You could look at carbons and nitrogens and oxygens and hydrogens and those kinds of things. But we're going to start off with a molecular level. A molecule will be something like a nucleotide. Nucleotides, we talked about that back in the first section. Nucleotides are the building blocks for things like DNA. Okay, so if we take a bunch of nucleotides, 1 million nucleotides or 10 million nucleotides, and string them all together, you get a piece of DNA. Call it macromolecule, big molecule. Now, we talked a second ago about emergent properties. Emergent properties are those things that come out as complexity increases. So even though molecules have their own characteristics and traits, it's only when you put them together as DNA that DNA can do the things that DNA does. And those new traits that pop up are called emergent properties. DNA is a really good molecule for storing information. Nucleotides by themselves, not so much. You got to have the entire thing here to store information. If you take a bunch of macromolecules and hook those together, you can have something called an organelle. So this is a ribosome. We talked about ribosomes, the protein workbenches inside the cell. We've got a ribosome here. This is a piece of what we'll call mRNA. This is a protein that's being made, but this blobby thing here is the ribosome. Ribosomes are made out of different kinds of macromolecules. They're made out of RNA, and they're also made out of proteins. 2 different macromolecules make a ribosome. And ribosomes can do stuff that neither DNA, or RNA, or protein by itself can do. The ability to make proteins for a ribosome is an emergent property, because they can't do it unless they have both the DNA and the RNA there. All right, if we take a collection of organelles together working to do kind of the same overall task, we have something called a cell. And cells have all kinds of stuff, lots of organelles. They have not only ribosomes, they can have nuclei and smooth ER and rough ER and mitochondria, chloroplast sometimes, vesicles, lysosomes, vacuoles, all kinds of stuff, right? Lots of fun stuff happening inside that cell. It takes all of those organelles together to make a cell. And cells have emergent properties. Cells, for example, are alive, right? There's a whole, with the whole first 20 minutes of this lecture, we're on properties of life. Cells are alive. Ribosomes are not alive. Cells are alive. So it takes this leap from single organelle to multiple organelles to have something we can call a living thing. Again, we call those emergent properties. New traits that show up as complexity increases. If we have a group of cells working together, we call that a tissue. Tissues could be something like brain tissue, nervous tissue, could be connective tissue, could be epithelial tissue, could be muscle tissue. Right? Tissues are collections of cells doing the same job. And unless you have all of those different cell types working together, they're not going to work as a tissue. You got to have all the cells there together if that tissue is going to do what it's supposed to do. If you take a collection of tissues working together, you can have an organ like a brain. Right? So the brain, for example, is made up of not only nervous tissue, neurons and so forth, but it's also made up of epithelial tissue. Got some connective tissue in there as well. So you've got 3 tissue types together that make up the organ. The brain cannot function unless all 3 tissue types are there. It takes all the players to make the whole system work. And that's again part of this whole emergent property idea. A collection of organs working together we call an organ system. Organ systems are things like the brain and spinal cord. Together we call that the nervous system. So we've got, now again, emergent properties, new traits that show up as you increase in complexity. The nervous system can do things the brain by itself can't do. We call those emergent properties. If we take all the organ systems working together, now we have an organism. So if we take not only the nervous system, but the digestive and the respiratory and circulatory and immune and integumentary and urinary and all the other ones, that makes up the organism. And the organism, of course, can do things that no individual system by itself can do. We call those emergent properties. Okay, so hopefully that idea is starting to sink in a little bit. Once we get beyond the organism level, we can start looking at some broader scale levels of organization. So we're going to start off next with a population. A population is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same place at the same time. They have to be of the same species. You got to be really careful how you define this. Species is a word that's both singular and plural. You could have one species, you could have 10 species. So like you could have one deer, you could have 10 deer. It's both singular and plural. Okay? So if you're defining population, you have to say a group of individuals of the same species, of a single species, of one species. It's really important to distinguish what you're talking about in terms of how many species are actually there. It's a group of the same species in the same place at the same time. We're going to skip the next one for a second and come back to it. Actually, no, we're not. We're going to talk about species next. What does that term mean? A species, in the biological definition of this term, is a group of organisms that are actually or potentially interbreeding, and that they're reproductively isolated from other such groups. A group of organisms actually or potentially interbreeding that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. The litmus test here to tell if two organisms are the same species or separate species is whether or not they can reproduce successfully. If they can, they're the same species. If they cannot, they're in different species. Okay? Now, a community. And by the way, before I forget, this little abbreviation here, SPP is more than one species. This is like two or more species. SP would just be one species. Okay? A community is a group of all the species in the same place at the same time. So it's definitely now more than one species in the same place at the same time. Let's just for a second go back to our idea of emergent properties, right? Communities, where you've got multiple species living together. Whenever you have multiple species living together, you can have things like predation. You can have things like competition. You can have things like mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, herbivory, those kinds of things that you cannot have if you just have a single species. You can't have predation if there's a single species, typically. You cannot have mutualism if there's a single species. You can't have herbivory if there's a single species. You can have parasitism if there's a single species. All of those kinds of things are things that show up only when you have more than one species. They're examples of emergent properties. The next level of organization is called the ecosystem. The ecosystem includes not only the living part of the environment, but also the non-living part, the abiotic conditions. Abiotic means non-living. So not only do you have now your community, you also have nutrients, you have water, you have energy, you have disturbances, fires and glaciers and those kinds of things. All of those non-living parts of the environment interacting with the living parts of the environment make up the ecosystem. And then finally, the very last one is the biosphere. The biosphere is the entire part of the planet where life exists. And that particular term is not especially useful from a practical standpoint, but you do see it used from time to time. Right? So biosphere is the entire part of the planet where life exists. So from the cell all the way up to the biosphere, you should be able to define those terms. You should be able to put them in order, from smallest to biggest, biggest to smallest. And of course, you should also be able to define or tell me what is meant by the term emergent properties. Okay? Because again, that's a pretty central kind of point in this chapter. Right, so that's our organization. Atoms, molecules, macromolecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, organisms, kind of front and center here. So we're now right here. From organisms, we go to populations, single species, same place, same time. We've got communities, all the species in the same place at the same time. Now we throw in the ecosystem with sunlight and water and nutrient flow and those kinds of things. And then eventually you got the biosphere. All right, so just as kind of a quick, do we know what's going on so far at this point? I'd like you to take a second, pause the lecture, think about this question. Okay? All right, so this question, I'm assuming you've paused it, now unpause it, right? Life is an emergent property. We're going to go back here for a second. On this picture right here, all of these things, molecules, macromolecules, organelles, none of these three things by themselves is a living entity. It's not a living organism. They can't reproduce on their own. They can't grow on their own. They can't do metabolism on their own. They don't respond to stimuli on their own. You get the point, right? They don't have the properties of life. But then all of a sudden, when you get to the cell has the properties of life. So as you go from organelle to cell, the emergent property that emerges is life. And all those features of life that we talked about a few minutes ago. Going from technically a non-living thing to a living thing is an emergent property. Okay? So hopefully that's kind of making sense. And of course, I should say this too. You should always, always, always email me or ask me if you have questions. If you don't understand this or anything else, don't hesitate to ask. That's why I'm here. Okay? All right, so I'm going to again stop here for a second. I'm going to shut this section of the lecture down and pick up with a third section and finish out the lecture with that.